I guess an assumption that I have is that most people are not win-win oriented, that something in our culture has almost inhibited us from seeing the possibilities, the creative possibilities in negotiations.
No, I would disagree with you. I think most people are win-win oriented. They just don't know they're win-win oriented. Let's put it that frame of reference.
Yes.
So that you have to instill this win-win in them. You have to show them that the process requires someone that's giving something, something that's getting something. Now, the way I put it is a little bit differently. Let me use my words, and I think the meaning is the same. I find most people want to get something before they give something. They want to get something before they give something. So it is very easy, I find, to work with someone, to negotiate with someone that wants to get something before they get something, providing I'm willing to give something before I get something. So the two different styles or philosophies or concepts don't clash. Literally, they mesh. If I'm willing to give you something, providing I can get something, and if your orientation's the other way around, you're not going to give anything until you get something, are we going to clash? Now, it's when two people get together that both want to get something before they give something, and that's the area, that's where you got the problems.
Negotiating for mutual gain and win-win settlements, the strategy in which both parties negotiate their differences to arrive at a solution which is acceptable to both parties. The challenge, as Hank Calero just indicated, is to develop a climate in which the negotiators can tap the creative possibilities in negotiations, and in which each party indicates to the other that I want to find a solution in which you get what you want and I get what I want, a solution that satisfies both of us and where both of us win. In examining this strategy, we'll focus on the following areas. We'll determine the conditions under which a negotiator should use this strategy, and we'll identify the clues that would indicate that a mutual gain settlement is feasible. We'll set guidelines for building a climate under which win-win solutions to conflict are possible. We'll indicate specific techniques and methods to set the stage for a win-win solution, and we'll discuss how to manage the dynamics of negotiating for mutual gain settlements. Before we examine these areas, we should make a clear distinction between negotiating for mutual gain and the strategy of negotiating for compromise settlements. In the previous cassette, we discussed the differences between conflicts over means and conflicts over ends or long-term goals. We indicated that the real long-term goals and values of the two parties in conflict are more similar than they think, simply because the two parties are interdependent. They need each other, or else they would not be negotiating in the first place. The problem is that their long-term mutuality of interest gets subverted or lost in the conflict. In organizations, the long-term mutuality of interest between organizational members is the growth and survival of the organization. If the organization crumbles, obviously the need to negotiate the differences between staff and line, sales and production departments, and all types of interpersonal conflicts would disappear, and so would the negotiating relationship. The same mutuality of interest is true in labor management and buyer-seller negotiations. If this did not hold true, most negotiations would be win-lose confrontations. The critical point here is that in all negotiations, there is a common exchange relationship. Each party has immediate and future resources the other party needs. When two parties in a negotiation or in any type of conflict lose sight of their mutuality of interest, the major question becomes, do we solve the conflict my way or your way? More often than not, each side sees their solution as being incompatible with the solution being proposed by the other negotiator. As a result, each party argues about the superiority of its own solution rather than joining forces to find a new solution which is acceptable to all. For example, When negotiators assume that there is a fixed resource which must be divided between the two parties, it sets up what is often called a zero-sum negotiation. What one side gains, the other side loses. This is the major characteristic of the negotiations for compromise settlement strategy. If the parties assume that the gain of one is the loss to the other, the dynamics of the search for compromise settlements can often wind up in each party using their energies against each other. Instead of working toward a mutually beneficial solution, each party twists or withholds information in order to raise the odds in their favor. However, there are many negotiating situations which are thought to be zero-sum, but which could be changed into a mutual gain for both. In negotiating for mutual gain, each party is committed to creating a climate in which each negotiator works to satisfy his own needs and the needs of the other party. Let me state this another way. They seek solutions which aren't unacceptable to either party. Negotiating for mutual gain focuses on defeating problems and coming up with creative solutions which meet the needs of both parties, rather than trying to resolve their conflict through trading, splitting the difference, bargaining, or submitting the issue to a majority vote. At this point, we've come to another major characteristic of negotiating for mutual gain. We must develop a problem-solving climate between the parties. This can be accomplished by getting the parties to accept that conflict can be helpful, provided that it does not result in threats or defensiveness. They must be concerned about developing openness and trust, and by developing a common responsibility to be open and honest about facts, opinions, and feelings, to recognize their mutual symbiotic relationship. It is only when this mutuality is recognized by the parties that they become willing to consider the needs of the other party rather than only their self-interest. An analogy to illustrate the differences between negotiating for mutual gain versus negotiating for compromise settlements is the situation of two parties fighting over an orange. The parties eventually compromise and cut the orange in half, only to find out later that one wanted the orange for juice, while the other needed the orange peel to make candy, which means that the conflict could have been resolved to their mutual satisfaction if there had been enough trust between the two parties to have allowed them to clearly identify their needs, and as a result the conflict could have been resolved with both parties being 100% satisfied. Now let's examine the steps a manager or negotiator can take to bring about mutual gain settlements through building a collaborative, open, problem-solving environment between the two parties. I asked Dr. Warren Schmidt to indicate the guidelines we can follow in reaching these win-win settlements. Warren is a professor at the University of Southern California's School of Public Administration and a nationally known consultant for over 20 years on the management of conflict and organization development. Warren, what steps can a manager or negotiator take to resolve conflict so that there is a mutual gain for both parties?
The first thing I have to do is really to try to understand, to listen and understand where you're coming from and what it is you really want. Well, the research has all shown that each party understands his position much better than he understands the other party's position. And if we're going to collaborate, I really need to make an effort to understand what the world looks like from where you're sitting, what it is your goals really are. Sometimes we even try to prevent people, from expressing their view fully in conflict situation. We get annoyed at it. We don't want to hear. So if I want to collaborate, I must first understand what it is you want, so that we can make a very clear statement of your goals and my goals, where they're alike, where they're different. We have to bring the real differences out in the open and focus on them, but also to focus on the areas of agreement. Sometimes we can break the problem down into portions, start with those areas where agreement is easiest to make, and get that kind of momentum going, leaving the more difficult differences for later on. So this involves clarifying the nature of the conflict and to try to define goals in a less biased way. The trouble is, in conflict, we sometimes find language to describe what the other party wants in such a demeaning way that he can't possibly agree to it. So we have to define it in as unbiased a way as possible. I think it is important in myself to watch for tendencies to move this into a win-lose situation, knowing that, for example, when I feel threatened, I probably am moving in a win-lose direction. And I should pause and ask, why am I doing this? And again, what is it you want and what is it that I want? I think it's important to avoid absolute statements that commit me irrevocably to certain kinds of positions that will make it embarrassing to pull back from. Sometimes, either when I'm a party to the conflict or when I'm a third party helping other people resolve things, I can maybe suggest procedures for our handling our differences. Like to say, well, look, let's play out a scenario. Let's take your point of view and let's see if we followed what you're recommending, what's likely to happen. And then let's look at my proposal and play that one out so that we both have a better idea of what we're talking about. To suggest some kinds of procedures like that, or to suggest, look, we've been going at this hot and heavy for 2 hours, maybe it's time for us to take a break. So to think procedurally. If we really want to collaborate, I think we have to spend some energy looking at our relationship and kind of reminding ourselves that that we really need each other, and to indicate the kinds of positive things that are in our relationship, and not just focus on the issue.
Warren, all these steps emphasize that to negotiate a conflict for a mutual gain settlement, it's important to not only deal with the content of the issue, but also the process or the climate of the relationship between the individuals involved, their openness, their trust for each other, and their concern for each other's needs and feelings.
That's right. Whatever we can do to increase the level of trust between us increases the chances that we can collaborate. Now, part of that involves my being in touch with my own feelings and my being as congruent, as open as possible with you in expressing where I am. Because as you know, if I give you mixed signals, if my words say one thing but my facial expressions say something entirely different, you're not sure what to believe. And you distrust me more. And we get into that kind of game playing thing. So attending to the process, to the way we listen to each other and the way we talk to each other, is a very important part of the whole collaborative mode. We also need to watch whether we're staying responsible or not. One of the things that has always intrigued me is that sometimes the presence of a third party or even a public representative in a labor management dispute makes a difference. The fact that some other party is there keeps us more responsible in what we demand and what we claim and what we assert. So I need to watch that. I need to watch this level of tension between us And knowing that when the tension gets too high, it pushes us both toward being more defensive, toward being unable to see other alternatives, and that's a time to do something to break that tension, to move it back into more manageable lines. And then I think it's also important, if we're really to resolve a conflict healthfully, that we have to periodically spur one another's feelings of hope and optimism, that we can find a way through this. There's an awful lot of energy that gets expended in conflict, and you can get tired and discouraged. And part of the process is maintaining that kind of atmosphere of hope.
Much of what Warren has described is the importance of the attitudes the negotiators or managers have as an important prerequisite to effectively negotiating for mutual gain through problem solving. First, in their attitudes and actions they communicate a belief in the possibility and desirability of a mutually acceptable solution. They say to each other in effect that we will have succeeded when we solve the problem in a manner which meets the needs of both parties and is not unacceptable to anyone. Second, they have a sense of equality. They realize that differences in status can create obstacles which hinder effective communications, a key element in problem solving. Third, they demonstrate a belief in cooperation rather than competition, but also value differences of opinion as a source of creativity. And fourth, they communicate their belief that problem-solving groups with high trust will search more extensively for alternative courses of action and be more satisfied and committed to a decision reached through consensus. Up to this point, we have discussed problem solving and its importance in negotiating for mutual gain. Now we want to present a framework for problem solving, some of the specific steps that are involved in this process, and the clues we can search for to see if we're on track. This framework will set the stage for the many methods and examples of problem-solving techniques, which will be given by our panel members in the remainder of this cassette and throughout the program, and which they have used to turn these guidelines into action. There are 7 stages in this problem-solving process, each one important for ultimately achieving mutual gain settlements. Establishing the right climate, identifying the problem or issue, searching for alternative solutions, evaluating alternatives and their consequences, selecting a course of action, implementing the chosen course of action, and evaluating and modifying the chosen course of action. Now let's examine each of these steps and what is required for effective problem solving. First, establishing the right climate. In our interview with Warren, he stressed the importance of process as an important element of negotiating for mutual gain. I want to go into that further because process is at the heart of establishing the right climate. In all negotiations, and really in all interactions between 2 or more people, there are 2 major ingredients: content and process. Content deals with the issue or task the 2 sides are working on. In most negotiations, the focus of the negotiators is on resolving the issues, achieving a settlement, and getting the job done. Group dynamics, or process, deals with the styles of influence each negotiator is using on the other, the quality of the communications, their feelings of cooperation or conflict, and the level and types of verbal and nonverbal participation by each member of the negotiating team. Process, in other words, is the quality of the relationship between people as they work towards getting the job done. In most negotiations, very little attention is paid to process, even though it is critical to getting the job done effectively. The more aware we can become of these group processes and how to influence them, the greater our chances of developing an open, trusting, problem-solving climate. Let me stress this again. Building and maintaining this climate during negotiations is critical for generating creative solutions so that there is a mutual gain to both parties. There are several guidelines we can use to determine if the negotiating climate is conducive to problem solving. First, are individuals free to express their personal opinions rather than just representing their own constituency? The more we can get each other to deal without the constraints of having to represent a constituency and the pressures and interests they represent, the more open we can be together in examining the constraints and alternative ways of dealing with problems. Negotiators often do this by meeting with each other informally at home for a meal or drink, or in informal conferences before and during actual negotiations. A second criteria for a high-quality negotiating climate are the needs, interests, and goals of both parties known to each other. Is the level of openness sufficient enough so that they can raise these with each other? Or are they fearful that if by being open, they raise the chance of being taken advantage of? A third criteria is whether status differences are minimized to encourage the free flow of information and communications, or are meeting sites and titles used to create feelings of deference and superiority. The next stage in problem solving is identifying the problem and ensuring that the mutual needs and interests are clearly understood by the parties. Effective problem solving requires that the problems and issues be clearly identified before the parties start developing and evaluating alternatives. However, one common characteristic of most human interactions is a tendency to immediately evaluate someone's comments. Rather than listening and allowing diverse opinions and perspectives to be expressed, each viewpoint is immediately judged. This constant evaluation can and does inhibit people from expressing their ideas because they know someone in the room will evaluate it and shoot it down. Another important consideration in this stage of problem solving is choosing those issues which have a high potential for mutual gain settlements. Some issues must be resolved through compromise because they represent a fixed resource. So it's important for both parties to clearly understand which type of issue they are dealing with and to shift their negotiating strategies and styles appropriately. A final consideration in this stage of problem identification is how to state the issue or problem so that it strengthens the potential for win-win settlements. The following suggestions may be helpful. First, state the issue as a problem which must be solved to meet the needs of both parties. In effect saying, I want a solution which meets your needs and my needs and will be acceptable to both of us. Second, state the problem as a goal to be reached or an obstacle to be solved rather than a solution. Or in other words, this is a problem I am experiencing rather than this is a solution I am proposing. The first approach describes a negotiator's needs and does not prescribe a solution, while the second statement proposes the answer. Third, make sure the problem or issue is stated specifically. Quite often, in the initial stages of a negotiation, issues are stated abstractly or as generalities. Part of this is the feeling out process. But as the negotiations get down to business, it's important to find out the real needs of the other party by asking them to define the needs, problems, and issues more specifically. Part of this is also involved in carefully doing one's homework prior to the negotiations. For example, finding out what demands are being placed on a negotiator by his constituency, what are his expectations, and what are the intangible issues which he is bringing to the negotiations. Perhaps, as one of our panelists has indicated, he may want to prove something rather than get something. Getting a party to identify his needs may require patience and persistence before a problem is finally defined, which lends itself to a variety of alternative solutions. A fourth consideration in defining an issue so that it has the potential for a mutual gain settlement is to state the issue without being accusatory or judgmental. To say, "I don't see the issue the way you do," is quite different from saying, "Your opinion is wrong." The former is a description of a person's perception or opinion. The latter is an evaluation and a judgment of the other party. To summarize this second stage, creative problem solving cannot occur unless both parties are willing to bring differences out into the open, unless they faithfully and accurately communicate their needs, and be willing to listen and accept each other's needs as important and legitimate. The third stage in effective problem solving is the joint search for alternate solutions to each problem. A key consideration here is the need to allow a large number of different alternatives to be identified. And again, this requires that ideas be allowed to emerge without having to be evaluated, and which allows each person in the negotiation to tap his own creativity, opinions, and sources of information. Time plays an important part in allowing individuals a chance to prepare and search for generating these alternative solutions. So advance notice of when a negotiation will take place and what agenda items will be covered should always be taken into account. Time constraints should be minimized. High-quality problem solving occurs most often when the parties are not pressured by deadlines. The fourth stage in problem solving is evaluating the alternative courses of action. The most important criteria in this stage are to evaluate alternatives based on their potential to solve a problem rather than conforming to a precedent. In addition, each alternative should be evaluated on the basis of facts rather than opinions, and each alternative should be examined not only on what their anticipated effects will be, but also possible unanticipated effects. The fifth stage in the problem-solving process is selecting a course of action after the alternatives have been evaluated. This is the process by which the two parties arrive at an agreement which is mutually acceptable to both. The key element here is mutuality. In making a decision, both parties consider the needs of each other and focus on reciprocity rather than self-interest. And the decision is made by consensus rather than by majority vote or trade-offs, bargaining, or compromises. The sixth stage is implementing the chosen course of action. Here the concern is on making sure that all the steps and responsibilities for carrying out a decision have been clearly laid out. This includes establishing clear criteria which can be used to evaluate whether the chosen course of action is successful. These steps in the sixth stage lay the foundation for the final stage in the problem-solving process, evaluating and modifying the outcomes from the decisions reached and the actions taken. It is also important to establish a commitment early in the problem-solving process that both parties will be willing to re-examine a decision once it has been implemented. This commitment frees some of the anxiety in problem-solving because quite often decisions require judgment calls, and many unanticipated factors can impact the consequences of a decision. Let's return to our interview with Dr. Schmidt, in which he will describe several techniques we can use to create a problem-solving environment and search for mutual gain settlements. Warren, what techniques and methods are useful for generating creative solutions to conflicts so that these conflicts can be negotiated for mutual gain so that both parties win?
Well, I think there are procedures, processes that increase the chances of finding that creative outcome. Sometimes just the selection of the location for the interchange is important. That this be done in a setting where both parties feel as comfortable as possible, where it isn't one person's office which gives him a kind of a psychological advantage over the other. And at the outset, if you can agree on some kind of ground rules on how we're going to approach this, some of the assumptions we're both entering this with, and that we remind ourselves that we want to seek a solution which both makes sense, and we want to walk out of here healthy people and with our relationship intact. Mm-hmm. Having said those kinds of things sets a context in which we can confront our differences. When we get into the interchange, some little techniques of what is called active listening make an awful lot of sense, because frustration mounts if people feel they're not being heard, not being understood. One of the most common ones, little techniques, is for each party to rephrase what he has understood from the other person before responding to it, to say, now let me see if I understand you right. Are you saying this, 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 and this? And when the other party says yes, then I'm free to respond to it. At least he knows that I've heard him. This helps to avoid the pseudo-conflicts which so often cloud the issues. It seems to me that whatever we can do to separate a person from his ideas is helpful, so that I can attack an idea without your feeling that I'm attacking you. The more we can develop the feeling that when each of us throws out an idea, it now becomes group property which we can look at and examine without either of our egos being involved. This helps. There's a very interesting diagnostic process that is sometimes helpful in conflict called force field analysis. This process developed by Kurt Lewin based on the assumption that human behavior can be seen as the product of a variety of forces. And if we can see together the goal that we are in agreement on, we can begin to look at what are some of the forces that are pushing us toward that goal, driving forces, and what are some of the forces that are getting in the way, that are preventing us from reaching those goals, the restraining forces. And if we can analyze a situation together that way, we can then begin to look at which of those forces can you do something about, which forces can I do something about, which do we have to live with. Few things are more helpful than just plain honesty and acceptance of the other person. Whatever I can do in that direction is helpful. I guess if I have to boil a lot of this down to a couple of words, the words that come to my mind are security and adequacy. As I believe that most of us behave most creatively and productively when we have a fairly high sense of security and a fairly high sense of adequacy. To feel secure basically means that I can trust my environment, the people around me. That they're more likely to help me than to hurt me, more likely to understand me than misunderstand me. When I feel insecure, I have to use a lot of my energy to protect myself and to weaken you so you can't hurt me. When I feel secure, I can focus my attention on the problem. The other feeling that's important is a feeling of adequacy, which means a feeling that I can make a difference, that I can influence, that I'm not just helpless here. If I feel inadequate, if you make me feel inadequate, then too I withdraw and have to defend. So in general, whatever we can do to make one another feel more secure and more adequate, the more it frees up our energy to focus on the problem that we're trying to solve, which is getting what you want and what I want.
Warren, can you recall a situation where, as a consultant, you've used these conflict resolution techniques to strengthen these feelings of adequacy and security?
Well, I can remember one very dramatic experience with one company. I had been working with this company for a long time with its executive team, and periodically we went out on retreats to look at their relationships and so on. On one of these occasions, we asked what relationship, if improved in this organization, would make the biggest difference. And we put a grid on the board, and people began checking where they thought a relationship could be improved to great advantage. And it came down to two of the vice presidents. I talked with these two men, both very personally secure people. And I asked them if they would be willing to confront one another in the presence of their colleagues and try to resolve their differences. And they both were willing to do this. So we set up, in effect, a conflict arena. We had 4 chairs, the two men facing each other, and then one chair in which I sat and an empty chair. I asked each one in turn to look straight at the other person and to tell him the kinds of things he was doing that really bothered him. And each person's job was to listen and try to understand that, because he would have his turn. And then we went through the process of each one telling the other one what he would like to do that would make his job and his department work better. And they listened to this. And then they began to build from that and say under what circumstances they could accommodate one another and so on. The empty chair was for any member of the group, any of their colleagues, to sit in and to make a comment or to help try to clarify the understandings and communications. It was a very dramatic kind of a situation, but in that case it turned out very well. There was so much desire, there was so much energy in that room pushing for a resolution that these two men, partly because of their strength and partly because of the help of their colleagues, were able to find new ways to work together and to have their departments work together. And I think we all went away from that feeling exhilarated because of what had happened.
We say the energy in the room, the supportive environment from the members of the colleagues of these vice presidents actually flowed in that room. And
it felt that way. It felt that way.
And what caused that type of energy to be generated?
Well, because there was a basic respect and trust among those people that had been built up over time. This would be a very risky and irresponsible thing to do in a group that didn't have that kind of trust.